The table was set perfectly, candles flickering, the scent of warm bread and roasted garlic filling the air. She'd spent the whole afternoon preparing, wanting everything to be flawless. Her husband's promotion depended on this dinner. The boss had to be impressed. She adjusted the collar of her dress, glancing at her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back looked different. She had taken extra time with her makeup, styled her hair in soft waves instead of the usual messy bun. It wasn't just about the dinner. It had been so long since she felt seen. The doorbell rang, and her husband hurried to answer, his voice filled with nervous excitement. Then he walked in, tall, confident, the kind of presence that commanded attention without asking for it. He carried himself differently, like a man who always got what he wanted. His handshake was firm, his smile effortless, and when his eyes met hers, she felt it. It was just a second, a flicker of something unspoken, but it was enough to make her breath hitch. She forced herself to focus, stepping forward with a polite smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you. My husband talks about you all the time." His gaze lingered on her, just long enough to make her question if she had imagined it. "All good things, I hope." She laughed lightly, but something about the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken. Dinner was smooth, too smooth. He complimented her cooking, asked about her interests, made her feel like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Her husband, eager to please, was oblivious to the way his boss's attention lingered on her. And the worst part? She liked it. She had spent years feeling invisible, like just another piece of furniture in their home. Her husband was a good man, but work had consumed him. Conversations had become short, touches had grown distant, and somewhere along the way she had started to feel more like a habit than a lover. But tonight, across the table, someone saw her. When she reached for the wine bottle, their fingers brushed. A small thing, a meaningless thing. But the way his eyes locked onto hers told her it wasn't meaningless at all. Heat crept up her neck. She pulled her hand back quickly, laughing nervously. "Sorry." "Don't be," he murmured, his voice deep, smooth. The air between them shifted. She could feel it. Did he? Her husband poured himself another drink, still deep in conversation, completely unaware. And for the first time in her marriage, she felt something she wasn't supposed to feel. Temptation. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the hem of her dress. It wasn't much different from what she usually wore, but it was a little more fitted, a little more intentional. She told herself it wasn't for him. It was just nice to feel put together. Still, the thought of him lingered longer than it should have. She had spent the last week replaying every detail of their first meeting. The way his gaze held hers a second too long. The subtle warmth of his hand when they brushed fingers. It had been nothing, it had been everything. Her husband had noticed nothing. When he mentioned another dinner with his boss, she had nodded casually, pretending it didn't send a spark of anticipation through her. "Of course," she had said, acting as if it didn't matter. But now, as she smoothed her hair, she knew the truth. It mattered too much. That evening, when he arrived, it was like the air changed the second he stepped inside. His presence filled the space effortlessly, his confidence natural, unforced. He greeted her husband first, all business, all charm, the perfect image of a professional superior. And then his eyes met hers. Something flickered between them, something unspoken. His lips curved in the slightest smirk, so small that anyone else might have missed it. But she didn't. Dinner stretched into conversation, her husband leading most of it. The boss responded with ease, nodding at the right moments, making jokes when necessary. But every now and then, his gaze would drift back to her. A glance that lasted just long enough for her to feel it. Her pulse quickened. She shouldn't be thinking about this. She shouldn't be feeling this. When she stood to grab more wine, she felt his presence behind her before she even turned. "Let me help with that." His voice was low, smooth. She hesitated but didn't stop him as he reached past her for the bottle. His fingers brushed her wrist, a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt through her. Her breath caught. She swallowed hard, gripping the counter. "Thank you," she murmured, forcing herself to look away. But he didn't move right away. He lingered just for a moment, just long enough for her to know it wasn't accidental. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, rejoining the conversation as if nothing had happened. She turned, composing herself, her hands shaking slightly as she poured the wine. She was imagining things. She had to be. But when she carried the glasses back to the table, his gaze met hers again, steady, amused, and she knew. She wasn't imagining anything. She set the plates down carefully, listening to the hum of conversation from the dining room. Her husband and his boss were talking, voices steady, laughter slipping through the pauses. To anyone else, the evening was perfectly normal. But to her, it felt anything but. She reached for the wine bottle, her hand steady despite the way her heart was racing. The kitchen felt too warm, too small, and she knew why. She wasn't alone. She could feel him before she turned around, the air shifting as he stepped closer. "Need some help?" His voice was low, almost teasing. She hesitated for only a second before forcing a smile. "I've got it." "Are you sure?" The tone of his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't talking about the wine. She turned slightly, her fingers tightening around the bottle as she met his gaze. His eyes were unreadable, but the way he was looking at her made it impossible to breathe. This was dangerous. Her husband was just in the next room. And yet, she didn't step away. He reached past her, his hand brushing against her waist as he grabbed an extra glass from the counter. The touch was barely there, but it sent heat rushing through her skin. She should have pulled back. She should have stopped this before it started. But she didn't. Instead, she stood still, letting the moment stretch just long enough for them both to acknowledge it. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor in the dining room snapped her back to reality. She exhaled, stepping aside, putting distance between them as if that could erase what had just happened. "Thank you," she murmured, forcing herself to look anywhere but at him. He didn't move immediately. She could still feel his presence, the weight of his attention lingering. Then finally, he stepped back, taking the glass with him. "Any time," he said smoothly before walking away. She pressed her fingers against the cool marble counter, trying to steady herself. Her heart was still pounding. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew the truth. This had already gone too far. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, the glow of the screen illuminating the darkness. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers hovering over the message notification. Him. "Can't stop thinking about you." Her breath hitched as she read the words. She shouldn't reply. She knew that. But her heart was already racing, her skin still tingling from the way his fingers had barely brushed against hers hours ago. She typed out a response, then deleted it, then typed again. "Her. We can't do this."
A minute passed, then another. Her pulse quickened when her phone vibrated again. Him. Then why haven't you blocked me? She exhaled shakily, her chest tightening. Why hadn't she? She wasn't naive. She knew what this was, what it could turn into. And yet she couldn't bring herself to shut it down, because for the first time in years she felt seen. Her husband barely noticed her anymore. Their conversations had become short, their nights quiet, their passion replaced with routine. But he, her husband's boss, had made her feel something she thought she had lost. Wanted. Another message appeared. Him. Meet me tomorrow. No excuses. She squeezed her eyes shut, guilt twisting in her stomach. But it wasn't enough to stop her fingers from typing. Where? The hotel room smelled of fresh linen and expensive cologne. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing them inside. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with everything left unsaid. He stepped toward her slowly, cautiously. He didn't touch her, not yet. Say the word, he murmured, his voice softer than she expected, and I'll walk away. Her lips parted, a response at the tip of her tongue. She should tell him to leave. She should turn around and go home, pretend this never happened. But she didn't move, because she didn't want to walk away. She looked up, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. I don't want to think, she whispered. His hand came up to her face, his fingers brushing against her cheek, trailing down her jaw. Her breath shuddered at the contact, her body betraying her. Then his lips were on hers, soft at first, hesitant, then desperate. A gasp left her as he pulled her closer, his grip firm, his warmth sinking into her skin. Her fingers curled into his shirt, holding on as the world blurred around her. There was no going back now. The moment their lips met, everything changed, and she wasn't sure she cared. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Him. Where are you? She stared at the screen, the words making her stomach twist. It wasn't excitement anymore. It wasn't that nervous thrill she had once felt when his name appeared on her phone. Now it felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. He had been texting more often, demanding, not asking.
Morning, night, even when she was with her husband, it had started small, little comments about missing her, wanting to see her again. But now it was different. She had tried to create space, told him she needed time, that things had gone too far. But he didn't listen. He always had an excuse, a reason to keep pushing. Another message came. Him. I know your husband is working late. Open the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands clenched around her phone as she glanced toward the door. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Outside, the night was quiet. But was he out there? A sharp knock broke the silence. Her heart pounded. She pressed a hand to her chest, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't normal. She moved to the window, carefully pushing aside the curtain just enough to peek outside. And there he was, standing at her doorstep, waiting. This wasn't about passion anymore. This was control. She stepped back, her mind racing. She had made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. She thought she could handle this, that she could keep it from going too far. But she had underestimated him, and now he wasn't asking anymore. The knocking turned into pounding. Open the door. His voice was calm, too calm. Her breath came in shallow gasps. What did he want? She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she typed. Leave. Now. The dots appeared immediately, but she didn't wait to see what he would say. Her mind was screaming at her to do something, anything. Her fingers hovered over her husband's name. Should she call him? Should she tell him everything? Number, not yet. Instead, she locked the doors, turned off the lights, and backed into the shadows. If she stayed quiet, maybe he would leave. Minutes passed, then, finally, footsteps, fading. She waited until she was sure he was gone before she let out a shaky breath. Her legs felt weak. She had to end this before it was too late. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face him. Her husband knew. His face was unreadable, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the tension in his muscles. He stood in the middle of the living room, staring at her, his hands balled into fists at his sides. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? "I got a call today," he said, his voice eerily calm, "from your lover." Her stomach dropped. "Number?" "He told me everything." His eyes darkened. "In detail?" She felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. He wouldn't do that. Except he would. The boss had always been about control. When she tried to pull away, he had tightened his grip. And now that she was slipping through his fingers, he had made sure to destroy everything. Her lips parted, a shaky breath escaping. "I don't," her husband snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't want to hear it." She had never seen him like this. Hurt, yes, but this was something deeper, betrayal that cut him to the core. He ran a hand through his hair, laughing bitterly. "How long?" Tears burned her eyes. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," his voice cracked. "You were my wife." She wiped at her face, but the tears wouldn't stop. "I didn't mean for this to happen." His eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't bear to see, disgust, disbelief, pain. "But it did," he said, shaking his head. "And now what? You think you can just say sorry and I'll forget?" She had no answer. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been lost. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "I want you out." Her breath hitched. "Out? This house? This life we built?" He gestured around them. "It's not yours anymore." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that they could fix this, that she had made a mistake, but the words felt hollow, because the truth was, she had already lost him. She turned toward the hallway, her steps unsteady. She needed to pack, needed to figure out where to go. But as she reached for the bedroom door, his voice stopped her. "Oh, and one more thing." She turned back slowly, her heart sinking. "I spoke to a lawyer." His expression was cold. "You get nothing." Her legs nearly buckled. He wasn't just leaving her, he was making sure she had nothing left. And for the first time since it all started, she realized she had never been in control.